Welcome to Bradford, the third largest city in Yorkshire, and a historic titan of industry that grew in size spectacularly from a small rural town just over 200 years ago into the major urban centre that we know today. Once upon a time regarded as the world's wool capital, Bradford is home to centuries of history from before, during and after its period of industrial might, nowadays home to a famously diverse population along with street after street of eye-catching and imposing Victorian architecture. We'll talk about all that and more on this walk around Bradford on a quiet and sunny morning, but we begin in the shadow of the city's most famous landmark, Bradford City Hall. Built over 3 years and opened in 1873, the City Hall, or as it was then known, the Town Hall, was inspired by a number of iconic buildings in Venice and Florence, and it was designed to be as large and elegant as possible so as to showcase Bradford's wealth and stature during the industrial era. Most importantly, however, it was intended to be just that little bit more impressive than the town hall of its industrial rival next door, the city of Leeds. Throughout the late 19th century, as industry skyrocketed and money poured into the region, both Leeds and Bradford became locked in a decades-long battle to outdo one another with increasingly extravagant architecture. One of the reasons that you'll see so many towering and majestic Victorian buildings on the streets of both cities. Here in Bradford, the City Hall is the most impressive example of that friendly architectural feud with Leeds, but the city is also home to an array of more modern developments that set it apart from its neighbour. Just beside the City Hall, we find ourselves on the wide-open Centenary Square, a huge public space opened in 2012 that's complete with shops, restaurants, and this wonderful mirror pool, complete with over 100 fountains, including the highest fountain you'll find in any British city, which shoots water over 100 feet into the air, half the height of the City Hall itself. During the warmer months, the mirror pool is often packed with families frolicking and paddling in the water, and it's always one of the loveliest places to be in Bradford, serving as a thoroughly welcome development to a city that's had its fair share of ups and downs over recent decades. We'll circle around Centenary Square's mirror pool before we walk into the heart of Bradford in a few minutes' time. But as we spin around here, we'll briefly make our way off the square to look at a couple of other famous Bradford landmarks, one of which is the city's really rather large former Odeon cinema. Covered in scaffolding at the moment as it's undergoing restoration, the cinema was opened all the way back in 1930 as the New Victoria, a mixed cinema and variety show venue, with capacity to seat 3,318 people, making it the largest theatre in the country outside London for its time. The building later became the Odeon and continued to operate as a major Bradford cinema until it closed down in the year 2000, and it thankfully survived a demolition threat in 2009 to remain standing to this day, now set to reopen in 2022 as a brand new events venue known as Bradford Live. Just beside the old cinema, meanwhile, there stands another historic venue, the Alhambra Theatre, opened in 1914, and which also boasts a huge auditorium with over 1,400 seats inside. The Alhambra is today the place where many touring West End productions put on plays here in Bradford, and along with the old Odeon cinema, this pair of entertainment venues give us a window into another part of Bradford's illustrious history. This city is famously associated with the visual arts, in particular film, with Bradford home to a long filmmaking heritage that goes all the way back to the birth of cinema. Here, we're passing by the National Media Museum, inside which the story of Bradford's filmmaking heritage is told, one of the most significant developments of which came back in 1896, when a local photographer by the name of Richard J. Appleton invented a device known as the Sierroscope, a combined camera, printer and projector, a revolutionary gizmo that allowed people to take and then immediately display photos or film, kind of like your phone does today. The Sierroscope was one of just a number of groundbreaking filmmaking innovations to come out of Bradford in the late Victorian era, and the city's important role in the development of early cinema was recognised back in 2009, when Bradford became the world's first UNESCO City of Film. That's not the only title that has been bestowed on Bradford on account of its often unsung cultural heritage, because as well as its well-known association with the wool trade, the Industrial Revolution, and one of Britain's most multicultural communities, the city has a lot of fascinating history to show off, and so just this year, Bradford was awarded the status of the UK's next City of Culture for the year 2025, during which time a number of cultural events will be staged here, alongside a range of redevelopment and regeneration works that will breathe new life into the city centre, in similar fashion to previous cities of culture, Derry, Hull and Coventry. Of course, Centenary Square here is already a modern breath of fresh air to be found in the heart of Bradford. But as we approach the City Hall once again, it's worth taking your time to examine the building in more detail, from both inside and outside. Uniquely, on its wonderfully ornate Gothic exterior, Bradford City Hall features a collection of carvings of all of England's monarchs between 1066 and 1873, when it was built, ranging from William the Conqueror all the way to Queen Victoria herself. It's an intriguing tidbit that's fascinating to explore if you have the time to take a lap of the City Hall, and it's a lot easier nowadays to spot those historical figurines, as for many years throughout the 20th century, Bradford City Hall wasn't coloured the imposing brown that we know today, but rather a dark black, on account of the thick soot billowing from mills and factories around the city for decades. Though actually rather iconic of the city for a long time, the City Hall's exterior was nicely cleaned up a number of years back. But very sadly, not everywhere in Bradford was left unscathed during the 20th century. At the foot of the City Hall, there stands a small monument that commemorates one of the worst disasters in Bradford's history, the Bradford City Fire of the 11th of May 1985. During a football match against Lincoln City on the last day of the season, in which Bradford City had actually just won the 3rd Division title, the club's rather old Valley Parade Stadium, made in large part out of wood, caught fire. Now, while the vast majority of the more than 11,000 strong crowd managed to escape the blaze, 265 fans were severely injured, and 56 were tragically killed, one of the worst disasters in the history of British football. The legacy of the Bradford City Fire isn't just shown in the form of the monument here in the heart of the city, but also in the stories of heroism by fans and locals around the stadium who helped others flee the fire, while new rules were immediately introduced to ban the construction of wooden grandstands at British stadiums. The Valley Parade Stadium, where Bradford City still play their home games to this day, was of course heavily redeveloped in the aftermath of the disaster, located not too far north of the city centre, where we are now. However, as we now make our way away from Centenary Square and the City Hall, we'll now head towards the very streets on which Bradford emerged from a small countryside market town into a titan of global industry, where medieval houses and shops were replaced with towering modern offices, banks, exchange halls, and more. But to get a better understanding of just how Bradford managed to grow into the major city of today, it's important to understand where it fits into the scope of the wider region by looking at a map. As we mentioned earlier, Bradford is neighboured by the bigger city of Leeds, just over 8 miles to the east, with the pair serving as the main population centres in the West Yorkshire built-up area, which along with Wakefield and Huddersfield is home to over 1.7 million people. Central Bradford here has for centuries been an important economic centre for that densely populated region, with Market Street here having historically served as the heart of banking in the city during the late 19th century. The old bank building before us here, built in 1885, as just one of a number of financial institutions along the road. Much like the historic wool trade, banking was another area in which Bradford was directly competing with Leeds for supremacy during the late Victorian era, although in that battle it appears that Leeds eventually won out, with just a few historic banks still operating in Bradford, while Leeds is today the largest financial centre in Britain outside London. But we mentioned the historic wool trade there, an industry which was dominant across this part of Yorkshire for centuries, long before the Industrial Revolution. Just under 800 years ago, a small market was active just a few streets away from where we are now, and it's likely that locally produced wool was an important commodity sold in medieval Bradford. At the time, the wool trade was a moderately profitable business for local traders, but over the course of a couple of centuries, it evolved into one of the most important arms of England's economy in the late medieval era, with English wool highly valued and sought after right across Europe. The villagers of Bradford benefited modestly from this acclaim, continuing to weave wool by hand in their cottages and farmhouses. But this humble local industry laid the groundwork for what would become Bradford's defining commodity as the Industrial Revolution took hold. And here on Market Street, we're passing by the building that stood right at the heart of Bradford's rise to international stardom in the wool trade. This gorgeous Victorian building of the mid-1860s is the Wool Exchange, built before the City Hall, and which was the first real show of Bradford's immense wealth and status at the time, almost all of which was down to wool. As the name suggests, the Wool Exchange was the place where traders bought and sold wool, with a grand, spacious hall inside, often thronging with businessmen doing deals that would grab them some of Bradford's world-famous wool, with an estimated 2/3 of all of Britain's wool in the mid-19th century being processed right here in Bradford. Such was the importance of wool to Bradford and Bradford to wool, that the city was christened with the nickname Woolopolis, to which purveyors of wool would flock from all over the world, though not all could simply waltz into the Wool Exchange. The trading floor inside the building was open only to members, producers whose wool was certified for quality, and buyers who were sponsored by or represented legitimate organisations. As such, members of the Wool Exchange held a distinctive social status among Bradford's wealthiest classes at the time, and could often be seen being schmoozed in the city's rapidly growing sphere of leisure venues, more of which we'll see later on in our walk. Neighboured across Hustlergate here by the City Vaults, a former bank and today one of Bradford's favourite pubs, the Wool Exchange remained a core part of the city's most important industry for decades, with trading continuing inside the Wool Exchange until the early 1970s, although the decline of the national textile industry throughout the 20th century eventually put paid to that historic practice. Now, having made our way past the Wool Exchange, we find ourselves in a labyrinth of Victorian design. As we turn to climb up Bank Street, another core arm of banking in the city, and where the first official Bradford Bank was opened back in 1803, you'll notice that pretty much all of the buildings around us look rather one and the same. This street was entirely redeveloped at least 3 times throughout the 19th century, as Bradford's economy went from strength to strength during the period, the buildings surrounding us here dating mostly from between the 1850s and 1870s, and which still play host to a couple of modern bank branches. But what came before this fetching and mostly Victorian city centre? Well, just off Bank Street, you would have once found Bradford's original centre for wool trade, the Peace Hall, an ornate building of 1773 that was used until the Wool Exchange superseded it in the mid-19th century. Long before all of this large-scale industry and trade, however, central Bradford was a classic rural market town, its market held here on Kirkgate. The street that leads up the hill towards the parish church, now Bradford Cathedral, was the historic home of commerce in Bradford for centuries, where not just wool, but all sorts of daily commodities were bought and sold. Much later in the 21st century, there now stands this huge building, Bradford's Kirkgate Shopping Centre, which was built in 1976 and replaced the city's historic Kirkgate Market Hall, a gorgeous Victorian building of 1872 that hosted markets in Bradford for nearly 100 years during its greatest period of prosperity. Still, the many Victorian buildings that do remain on central Bradford streets serve as a striking reminder of the city's historic glory, although the Industrial Revolution wasn't the first time that Bradford's star was looking up. As we mentioned, wool production had been taking place in Bradford for centuries before industrialisation, with a number of mills around the medieval village processing the product before being woven by hand by local residents. But Bradford's mills weren't only producing wool, and the presence of a successful market helped the area to become the site of a rather significant manufacturing sphere, with everything from corn mills to leather tanneries propelling Bradford to the status of one of Yorkshire's main centres of manufacturing by the 16th century, far bigger than Leeds at the time. Still, by that point, Bradford was still only a small rural town based around the three central streets of Kirkgate, Westgate and Ivegate, and its then promising growth was sadly stopped in its tracks by wider historical events, namely the English Civil War. When war broke out between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians in 1642, Yorkshire was hotly contested, serving in the early stages of the war as a stronghold for the King's forces. However, at the outset, Bradford was held by the Parliamentarians, and so the Royalists, aiming to shore up their control of northern England, laid siege to Bradford on 2 occasions, failing on the first occasion in 1642, but eventually taking the town in 1643. But as we look along the sloping main street known as Ivegate, just a year after the Royalists' victorious siege, as the tide turned in the war, Bradford was retaken by the Parliamentarians, and although the town wasn't necessarily crucial to the way the Civil War unfolded, the conflict really took its toll on Bradford's centuries of promising growth. Manufacturing, which had been gradually built up in the area for years, took a heavy hit as a result of the sieges, while the wool trade also suffered, declining further as the nearby town of Halifax began to cement itself as an international centre for wool, with its iconic Peace Hall a beacon of Yorkshire's wool industry in the 18th century. As we know, however, Bradford eventually went on to overtake Halifax once again as a centre for wool in the 19th century, giving birth to the great city that we're walking through today. But the ups and downs of the city's wool trade are just one example of the many trials and tribulations that Bradford has experienced over its long, long history. As we make our way past City Hall again, Bradford's early recorded history was also marked by difficulties, with the early medieval village being effectively laid to waste by the forces of William the Conqueror in the aftermath of the invasion of England in the 11th century. At the time, Bradford was only a small village of a handful of people, and so the settlement was able to rebuild itself as it began its road towards being a significant market town. Relatively little else is known of Bradford before the arrival of the Normans, although it was likely first settled in the Anglo-Saxon period on a wide crossing point of a local stream, or a broad ford as you might call it. That was the origin for the name Bradford, but the original ford is today buried far beneath the many developments of the following centuries, and here on Bridge Street we're now looking towards the mighty St George's Hall, the most famous of Bradford's plethora of grand entertainment venues. One of the first prominent buildings that marked the extent of Bradford's growth in the industrial era, St George's Hall was opened in 1853, as it became apparent that Bradford's old main venues were just too small for the burgeoning town. So, Bradford really wanted to go all out with St George's Hall, with initial designs for the new music hall featuring plans for a seating capacity for up to 4,000 people. Today though, St George's Hall holds room for a rather more modest crowd of around 1,500 people, but it's remained in use almost continuously over the 169 years since its doors first opened, making it one of the oldest concert halls still in use in the entire country. Through all that time, St George's Hall has hosted famous names from many different walks of life, including concerts from music legends like the Rolling Stones, David Bowie and more, as well as addresses from Charles Dickens, the famous explorer David Livingstone, and a young Winston Churchill. Although Churchill's speech to around 3,000 people in St George's Hall back in 1910 was famously disrupted by suffragettes, whose protestations that day helped their movement to gain traction. And just beside the famous St George's Hall, there stands an equally imposing Victorian building, the luxurious Great Victoria Hotel, built in 1867 and deliberately placed here beside Bradford's main events venue and one of its main railway stations, Bradford Exchange, which opened all the way back in 1850. Nowadays though, the Great Victoria Hotel sits beside a newer version of that historic station, known by the modern name Bradford Interchange, a combined bus and train station that opened in 1973 and which serves as one of the main entry points into the city from the rest of the country. The hotel and St George's Hall both easily in reach after you step out onto the platform. There is debate as to whether Bradford Interchange is merely a continuation of the original Bradford Exchange, or a whole new station in its own right, principally because it occupies a different, albeit very close by, site. Here, we're making our way around the back of the Great Victoria Hotel into the wide open forecourt of Bradford's impressive Crown Court building, which was built in the late 20th century, where the old Bradford Exchange station once existed. By contrast, the modern Bradford Interchange stands on the other side of the Great Victoria Hotel from this forecourt, on which we also find an eye-catching modern sculpture of what looks rather like a large leaf. It's a memorial dedicated to one of Bradford's most famous residents, the composer Frederick Delius, who was born into a family of wealthy wool merchants in the city in 1862, but forwent the family business for a life of music. Spending time in England, America's Deep South, Germany and France, Delius was influenced by a variety of musical styles that gave birth to his entirely unique, albeit unorthodox sound, one of the reasons that you might not have heard of Delius among the upper echelons of Britain's most famous composers. Still, Delius is another part of Bradford's expansive cultural heritage, and his own family heritage here links into the part of the city that we're now going to start walking towards. Having seen many of the main landmarks in Bradford's historic Victorian city centre, where commerce and leisure combined during the city's most prosperous era, we'll now make our way towards an area where business dominated, an area known by the name Little Germany. Frederick Delius was one of the many Bradfordians who formed a part of the city's significant German community, who played an important role in the development of the wool trade in the late 19th century. Now, of course, wool was a distinctly local industry for centuries and centuries, but from around the 1850s, there was an influx of European, particularly German, textile merchants who came to Bradford as the city established itself as the premier centre of wool trade in the world. Textiles were also a widespread industry on the continent. However, a series of conflicts between European powers throughout the 19th century caused instability in commerce between countries like France and Germany, while Britain was streaking ahead as the world's industrial and economic superpower. As such, Bradford was the place to be for all those looking to make it big in the wool trade, and so European merchants arrived in the city and built brand new warehouses on the streets just outside the historic heart of Bradford, in the area that's now known as Little Germany. We'll talk a little bit more about the history of Bradford's German community as we stroll past the historic warehouses of Little Germany in a few moments, but Bradford is famed as the home of an even more multicultural community than that. Nowadays, Bradford ranks among the most ethnically diverse cities in the entire country, having seen a series of waves of immigration over the last century and a half. In the early years of this major change in the city's makeup, many ordinary people in Bradford were only just beginning to see the benefits of the city's uptick in economic fortunes, and here we can see a sculpture that depicts a transaction between a local resident and an agent of the local small loans company Provident Financial, who were established in the 1880s to help those who worked in the city's factories, mills, offices and warehouses pay for essential everyday items. Of course, the huge growth in industrial and economic activity throughout the 19th century caused a surge in the local population, with Bradford exploding in size from a population of just over 13,000 in the year 1801 to nearly 280,000 in 1901. That initial wave of growth was driven mainly by people moving into the area from the Yorkshire countryside for work, followed by the influx of European merchants who sought to take advantage of Bradford's thriving wool sphere. European and particularly Jewish migration formed a major part of life in Bradford for much of the early 20th century, but in the aftermath of the Second World War, Bradford also became a place of settlement for many people from South Asia, bringing more hands to the city's continually ballooning workforce. Indian, Bangladeshi and especially Pakistani men typically came to Bradford to work in its factories, before being joined by their families after they had settled. And over the following few years, the city came to develop one of the UK's most significant South Asian communities, with Bradford's first mosque opening in 1959, and many opening new shops, cafes and restaurants in the city's inner suburbs. By 1964, Bradford was home to a community of over 12,000 Pakistanis, who had established more than 160 new businesses in the city, and although jobs in the textile mills gradually began to disappear for all those who lived in the city, Bradford's South Asian population continued to grow, with over a quarter of the city's population today home to those with a background from the region, a community so significant that you'll even find a Pakistani consulate in Bradford today. Now though, we find ourselves on the streets of Little Germany itself, the majority of the buildings that tower over us being warehouses and offices established by those European merchants who arrived in the city from the 1850s onwards. Their impact on the city was considerable, not only creating this entirely new commercial zone of Bradford out of nothing, but also going on to form an integral part of life in the city. Many of Bradford's wealthiest German wool merchants contributed to the building of St George's Hall and other major city landmarks, and as early as 1864, a Jewish German man named Charles Joseph Semon was elected the mayor of Bradford. Over the following decades, many famous Bradfordians were born into German immigrant families, from Frederick Delius to the painter William Rothenstein. And while the vast majority of German commercial activity in the city took place in the wool and textile trades on these streets, Bradford also saw a slew of German shops, restaurants and butchers established around the city, one of the first steps in its development as a famously multicultural centre of England. By the turn of the 20th century, 23 of Bradford's 36 wool merchants were run by Germans, and they continued to form a major part of the city's community until 1914. That was of course the year of the outbreak of the First World War, when many Germans in Bradford departed to go off and fight for the German army. Meanwhile, the British government introduced an ultimatum that required German citizens to return to the country within just 17 days of the start of the war, otherwise they would be imprisoned until the end of the conflict. This inevitably led to a major exodus of people from Bradford, but many, having been born and lived here all their lives, remained in Bradford. In fact, it's thought that as many as half of all the Germans who lived here changed their surnames during the First World War to escape persecution, and a number also fought for the British Army during the war, although many long-running German institutions in Bradford, like the German Evangelical Church, were forced to close during and even after the First World War. That's just a glancing look at the long history of multiculturalism in Bradford, and the city's impressive links with countries all over the world. But having now walked up through Little Germany, we find ourselves approaching the final landmark on our tour of Bradford, Bradford Cathedral. Situated on a prominent hill overlooking the modern city centre, Bradford Cathedral is the oldest building in central Bradford by quite some way, dating at its oldest all the way back to 1458. The cathedral as we know it today is a mishmash of rebuilds and restorations that stretch from 1458 right up to 1965, and for most of its life this was simply the parish church, St Peter's, before being designated a cathedral back in 1911 as Bradford grew in stature, having been awarded city status just a few years before in 1897. However, the site on which the modern cathedral stands is steeped in history, having been used as a place of worship for the entirety of Bradford's history, well over 1,000 years, with a church first built here in the Anglo-Saxon period, although it fell victim to the forces of William the Conqueror when they laid waste to the medieval village of Bradford in the 11th century. That original church was replaced by a short-lived Norman church, although that was destroyed by Scottish raiders in the 14th century, leaving this church to take its place, today surrounded by gorgeous gardens in a cathedral close guarded by very thick walls. If you ever walk past Bradford Cathedral up from the Broadway and the city centre, you might notice that it is rather well hidden from the rest of the city, principally by walls that are as much as 11 feet thick in places, a layover from the sieges of the English Civil War, when the walls proved an effective defence against bombardments from outside the town. In the early years of Bradford's history, the church here was the most important building for the local community, built on this hill overlooking the centre of town, and right on top of the stream known as Bradford Beck, the ford of which gave this place its name. Of course, over time and as industry developed, focus shifted away from the church to landmarks like the Wool Exchange and the City Hall, but the cathedral today stands in a rather more peaceful part of central Bradford, where you can take a break from its illustrious Victorian industrial heritage and get a taste of what this place was like long before its spectacular rise to prominence in the 19th century. But as we walk through the cathedral's grounds, we've now come to the end of our walk around Bradford, having made our way up from the spacious, modern Centenary Square beneath the City Hall to this calm and historic corner of the city. During that time, we've only just scratched the surface of Bradford's enthralling history, and there's so much more to learn on the city streets beyond what we've seen. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Bradford to explore its heritage for yourself sometime soon.